We open our inquiry with what Ronald Lee and David Reher have identified as one of the most important changes affecting human society in the past half-millennium. This is the demographic transition. It is an epochal shift that rivals the Industrial Revolution and the rise of democracy in its magnitude. Historically, the human experience was defined by short lives and many births, a biological necessity to ensure species survival amidst high attrition. Today, we inhabit a world increasingly defined by long lives and few births. This presentation goes beyond the surface data to explore the why and how of this global transformation. We will dissect the causes, map the divergent trajectories across continents, and ultimately confront the consequences of a world that has fundamentally reorganized its biological and social imperatives. Our analysis today follows a rigorous four-part structure. First, we must precisely define the lexicon of demography, specifically the interplay between fertility and mortality rates. Second, we will deconstruct the idealized four-stage model of transition, understanding it as a heuristic device rather than an immutable law. Third, we will analyze the primary drivers, examining why mortality decline acts as the, quote, prime mover, and how economic shifts accelerate fertility drops. Finally, we will evaluate the profound consequences of this transition, specifically the economic sweet spot of the demographic dividend, the inevitable challenge of aging societies, and the mass urbanization that has redefined our species' habitat. This is not just a study of numbers, but of the structural transformation of civilization. Scholars like Tim Dyson have argued that the role of the demographic transition has been, quote, generally underestimated in development theory. It is, in fact, a secular shift that underpins the modern world. Without the transition from high to low vital rates, the accumulation of human capital, the rise of urbanization, and the explosion of economic productivity would likely have been impossible. While critics have questioned the universality of specific models, the fundamental shift, the move from a high-pressure equilibrium of wastefully high mortality to a low-pressure equilibrium of controlled fertility, is undeniable. Understanding this mechanism is essential if we are to grasp contemporary challenges, ranging from the stagnation of economic growth in the West to the migration pressures facing the global South. For most of recorded history, humanity existed in a state of high-pressure equilibrium. Referencing the supplementary data, global population growth rates were glacial, often less than 0.1% annually before the year 1000. This stagnation was not due to a lack of births. Rather, it was the result of, quote, wasteful mortality. Total fertility rates, TFR, exceeded 5 or 6, yet these numbers were a biological necessity. Infant mortality was brutally high, with commonly over 300 out of every 1,000 newborns dying before their first birthday. Life was, in the Hobbesian sense, short and precarious. High fertility was therefore an insurance policy, a strategy to ensure that at least some offspring survived to adulthood to sustain the family unit. This was a world regulated by mortality, where famine and disease acted as hard checks on expansion. We must distinguish between our core metrics. Natural increase is simply the arithmetic difference between the crude birth rate and the crude death rate, excluding migration. However, for our analysis, the most critical variable is the total fertility rate, or TFR. This represents the average number of children a woman would bear in her lifetime, given current age-specific rates. Crucially, we must understand replacement fertility, typically 2.1 in developed nations. This is the tipping point. Above this number, a population replaces itself and grows. Below it, without migration, a population mathematically contracts over time. Understanding these variables is prerequisite to interpreting the transition models we are about to examine. This graph visualizes the mechanism of the population explosion. In stage 1, both birth and death rates are high and fluctuating, canceling each other out. The transition is triggered not by a rise in births, but by a plummeting death rate in stage 2, driven by sanitation and public health. Critically, the birth rate does not immediately follow. Cultural norms around large families are sticky and slow to change. This creates a lag, a gap between falling deaths and sustained high births, represented here by the shaded area. This gap is natural increase. It is only in stage 3 that fertility rates begin to drop in response to changed survival realities. Finally, in stage 4, we reach a new equilibrium of low birth and death rates. This lag period is the mathematical cause of the global population explosion of the 20th century. Reality rarely conforms perfectly to theory. When we examine specific national trajectories, we see significant departures. France, for instance, is a famous anomaly where birth and death rates fell almost in synchronization starting as early as 1827, thereby avoiding the massive population boom seen elsewhere. Sweden followed a more classic, gradual path. In contrast, South Korea represents a compressed transition, where the shift occurred with blistering speed. While critics argue these variations invalidate the model, the fundamental pattern remains: a universal shift from high to low rates. The value of the model lies in describing the destination, even if the journey varies in timing and speed. A key heuristic is that late starters proceed faster. Europe's transition was a slow march, closely linked to gradual industrialization over nearly 2 centuries. For example, the decline in England and Wales spanned from the mid-18th to mid-20th centuries. In contrast, East Asia executed a sprint. Countries like China and South Korea completed their transitions within a single human lifespan. Latin America followed a similarly rapid trajectory, with Brazil dropping from a TFR of 6.1 to 1.75 in just 60 years. This acceleration means that developing nations must manage social changes in decades that Western nations had centuries to absorb. France presents a fascinating deviation. Its fertility decline began decades before its neighbors, around 1827. Because mortality and natality fell in parallel, France avoided the explosive population growth seen in the UK or Germany during the 19th century. However, the graph also highlights the baby boom from 1945 to 1964, a significant, temporary reversal in the long-term trend seen across the West. Following this, we enter what demographers call the second demographic transition, characterized not just by low fertility, but by delayed marriage and fertility falling far below replacement levels, a trend now dominating Southern Europe. The Asian data reveals the most precipitous fertility declines in human history. China's TFR fell from roughly 6 in 1950 to 2.6, before the one-child policy was even implemented in 1980, suggesting that development drivers were already potent. South Korea achieved an even faster decline to ultra-low fertility, 1.2, without coercive measures. Perhaps most shocking is Iran. Following a policy reversal by the government in the late 1980s, Iran's TFR collapsed from over 6 to replacement level in roughly 15 years, a shift that took Europe a century. These cases prove that under the right conditions, the demographic transition can occur with explosive speed. Most African nations are currently in the early to middle stages of transition. Mortality has fallen, but fertility remains high, creating a quote youth bulge. Unlike the Asian trajectory, there is a noted cultural resistance to smaller families, with desired family sizes often remaining above 4 children. Factors such as high child mortality and lower female literacy continue to act as drags on fertility decline. Consequently, Africa is projected to drive global population growth, adding over 900 million people by 2050. However, the transition is underway. Countries like Ghana and Kenya are seeing substantial TFR reductions, signaling that Africa is following the universal path, albeit at a different cadence. As Tim Dyson argues, the decline in mortality is the universal quote prime mover. Historically, this was driven not by high-tech medicine, but by public health fundamentals: clean water, better nutrition, and sanitation. When infant mortality drops, when parents become confident that their offspring will survive to adulthood, the rationale for having many children as insurance evaporates. This is a crucial psychological and economic pivot. The transition starts in the sewers and the granaries, not just the hospitals. The decline in fertility is a rational adaptation to the new reality of survival. Beyond survival, the quantity-quality trade-off becomes paramount. As economies modernize, the demand for human capital rises, as noted by Oded Galore. Families choose to have fewer children, but invest more resources, education and health, in each one. Concurrently, female emancipation fundamentally alters the equation. As women gain access to education and the labor market, the opportunity cost of child-rearing increases drastically. Urbanization further accelerates this, as children in cities become economic liabilities rather than the agrarian assets they once were. These feedback loops lock in the low fertility trajectory. The lag between falling death rates and falling birth rates generated a hyperbolic expansion. It took humanity 250 years to double to 1 billion. The next doubling took only 123 years. The doubling to 4 billion took just 47 years. The peak growth rate hit over 2% in the late 1960s, an order of magnitude higher than the historic norm. While this, quote, sure expansion has ended and growth rates are slowing, the momentum has delivered us a world of 8 billion people. This vertical ascent on the graph is the transition's most visible legacy, transforming our impact on the biosphere. As fertility falls, a country enters a quote sweet spot. The number of young dependents shrinks, while the large youth bulge cohort enters prime working age. This drastically lowers the dependency ratio. There are more hands working than mouths feeding. This demographic dividend provided the fuel for the economic miracles. It is a window of opportunity where labor supply maximizes and savings rates increase. But it is crucial to understand that this is a temporary phenomenon. The bulge eventually ages, and the dividend disappears. We are now witnessing the final stage in advanced economies, the demographic burden. Japan is the harbinger of this new reality. By 2030, Japan is projected to have only 1.36 workers supporting every retiree. The population pyramid has inverted. This shift creates immense structural challenges: shrinking labor forces, exploding healthcare costs, and the solvency of pension systems. We are moving from a world of youth bulges to one of lowest low fertility, TFR less than 1.3, leading to absolute population decline in nations like Japan, Italy, and much of Eastern Europe. Demographic transition and urbanization are inextricably linked. The modernization of agriculture created rural labor surpluses, the push, while industrial cities created demand for labor, the pull. In 2007, we crossed a species-level threshold. For the first time in history, more than half of humanity lived in cities. We have transformed from a dispersed agrarian species into a concentrated urban one. This mass migration is one of the most consequential social shifts in history, fundamentally altering economies, lifestyles, and resource consumption patterns. In 1950, there were only 2 cities with over 10 million people, New York and Tokyo. Today, there are over 30, mostly in Asia. These megacities are the ultimate expression of the transition. They offer immense agglomeration benefits, economic efficiency, and innovation. However, they also concentrate risk. They are epicenters of resource consumption. Moving to a city typically doubles or triples a person's metabolic claim on the biosphere. Furthermore, they face, quote, mega risks from natural disasters and pandemics. As the transition stabilizes, our future will be defined by how we manage these colossal urban organisms. First, the transition is a universal, epochal shift from high to low vital rates. Second, while the pattern is universal, the paths are diverse. Asia sprinted where Europe marched. Third, mortality decline is the trigger, followed by fertility decline. Fourth, this process creates a temporary economic dividend that inevitably matures into a, quote, demographic burden of aging. And finally, this demographic shift is inseparable from our destiny as an urban species. These 5 pillars form the structural foundation of the modern world. As we settle into this post-transition world, we face profound questions. How will the diverging futures of a youthful Africa and a geriatric East Asia reshape global geopolitics? Can pro-natalist policies ever reverse the tide of population decline in the West? Will technology and automation solve the labor shortages of aging societies? Or is mass immigration the only mathematical solution? And finally, what are the environmental limits of a planet stabilizing at 10 or 11 billion people, most of whom will be urban consumers? The demographic transition has built the modern world, but it is up to us to navigate the complex reality it has left behind.